He buried his wife. He stood over the ashes, laid white flowers on cold ground, and swore revenge in blood against every soul responsible. 6 months of war. 6 months of whiskey and bodies and silence. Then one night, in the basement of his own nightclub, a pregnant janitor looked up from the broken glass she was sweeping and wore his dead wife's face. This is the story of what a man does when the grave gives something back. If you're new here, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me until the end. You won't see this ending coming.
Ako masih
The bottle was already half empty when Jitai threw it. It wasn't aimed at anyone specific. That was almost worse. The bartender ducked on instinct. 6 months of working for Kang Jitai, having sharpened his reflexes in ways no job training ever could. The bottle exploded against the far wall of the private lounge. Dark amber glass and darker whiskey spraying across the lacquered paneling. And then the room went absolutely still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that happens when every person in a space simultaneously decides that breathing too loudly might get them killed. Jitai stood behind the bar with both hands flat on the counter, head bowed, shoulders moving with the slow labor of a man trying to remember how to be calm. He was 34 years old, and he looked 10 years older than that tonight. His jaw was unshaved past the point of intentional. His dress shirt was expensive, charcoal gray, and he'd rolled the sleeves to the elbows sometime around midnight without noticing. The knuckles of his right hand were split. They'd been split for 3 days, and he hadn't done anything about them. Around him, the private lounge of Club Baeko hummed with the suppressed tension of men who were paid well to keep their opinions to themselves. 2 bodyguards near the door. A lieutenant named Park Sung-jin, standing close to the leather couch with a phone he wasn't looking at. A personal secretary whose name Jitai kept forgetting, hovering near the door with a tablet and the expression of someone mentally composing his resignation. The music from the floors below reached them as a vibration more than a sound. Bass frequencies moving through concrete and steel, the club at full capacity on a Thursday night, 200 people spending money and drinking and existing in ways that felt obscene to Jitai right now. He didn't know why he'd come down tonight. He hadn't been to the club in 3 weeks. Then something about the penthouse had closed in on him around 11, and he'd gotten in the car without telling anyone where he was going, which had sent the security detail into the kind of quiet panic they expressed by simply following him everywhere without comment. "Get out," Jitai said. Nobody moved immediately, which was the wrong choice. He looked up. His eyes were dark and flat and very direct, the eyes of a man who had learned to turn certain things off behind them. "I said get out, all of you. Give me 10 minutes. Sung-jin opened his mouth. 10 minutes, Sung-jin. Go stand in the hallway and be useful out there." They filed out. The secretary went first with evident relief. The bodyguards last, exchanging the kind of look that said they'd be pressed against the door with their ears working hard. That was fine. Jitai didn't care what they heard. There was nothing left in him tonight that felt worth protecting. He reached under the bar and found another bottle, poured 2 fingers without looking at the glass. The whiskey was good. Everything in Club Baeko was good. That was the point of the place. That was always the point. And it tasted like nothing. It had tasted like nothing for 6 months. He drank it anyway and poured again and stood there in the wreckage of the first bottle he'd thrown, glass crunching faintly under his shoes when he shifted his weight, and thought about Naomi. He thought about Naomi every night. That was the trap of it. He'd thought that grief was supposed to dull with time. That this was the deal. That a man endured the sharpest months and then slowly the edge came off and life reassembled itself into something livable. Nobody had told him that some grief didn't dull. Some grief just went underground and moved around under the surface. And you'd be standing in a bar thinking about nothing in particular, and then some small random thing. A song, a color, the way the light hit a glass at a certain angle, would surface it all at once like something dragged up from deep water. And you'd be back at the beginning, back at the hospital. Back at the moment they'd led him into the white room to identify the remains, and the smell had hit him first, chemical and sweet and wrong in a way his body had understood before his mind caught up. They hadn't been able to do much with the identification. The car bomb had been thorough. He'd been shown a ring, her ring, the thin gold band with the small inset stone she'd worn since their wedding. and a fragment of a dental record, and he'd stood there in that white room and felt something detach inside his chest, some load-bearing structure quietly giving way, and he'd said yes. He'd said yes, that's her. And then he'd walked back out into the corridor and sat down on a plastic chair and stared at the wall for 40 minutes while men he employed stood around him not knowing what to do. That was 6 months ago. Since then, he had done several things. He had buried her, or what could be buried. He had identified the organization believed responsible for the bombing, a mid-tier operation called the Red Crane Group that had been making territorial moves along the Mapo corridor. And he had disassembled them with a methodical violence that had sent a message clear enough that 2 other rival groups had immediately requested meetings to discuss peaceful arrangements. He had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours on any night since March. He had drunk more whiskey than any doctor would call reasonable, and had eaten in the distracted, functional way of a man who understood that his body required fuel but couldn't locate the appetite to care. He had run the Baco Syndicate, 38 active operations, 11 legitimate front businesses, a network of relationships and obligations, and carefully maintained threats that stretched from Seoul to Busan to 3 cities in Japan, with the cold precision of someone who'd converted grief entirely into function. And some nights he came down to the club and threw bottles at walls, and that was the part of himself he couldn't quite systematize. He was on his 3rd pour when he heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More an awareness of presence. The specific quality of the air changing when another person enters a space you thought was empty. He looked up from the glass and scanned the room and found her in the far left corner, half hidden by the service alcove, down on one knee with a dustpan and a small brush, quietly and methodically collecting the broken glass he'd created. He hadn't heard the side door open. He didn't know how long she'd been there. She was pregnant. Visibly, unmistakably pregnant. The kind of late-term fullness that changed a person's center of gravity. That she was accommodating with one hand braced against the wall as she worked. She was wearing the gray uniform of the cleaning staff, her hair pulled back, her attention entirely on the broken glass and the careful business of collecting it without cutting herself. She hadn't looked up yet. Maybe she didn't know he was watching. Maybe she'd decided that the safest approach to this room and its occupant was to do her work and get out without drawing attention. Jite stood very still. There was something about her that had snagged his attention in a way he couldn't immediately explain. The angle of her jaw, the line of her shoulders, the particular way she held herself even in a position of practical labor, a certain composure, something almost careful about the way she moved. He watched her work and felt something shift in his chest that wasn't grief exactly, and wasn't anything else he had a name for. Then the air moved. The ventilation system, probably, some minor adjustment in the flow through the room, and with it came a scent, faint, almost not there. Something floral and warm underneath the whiskey and the cleaning products and the synthetic air of the lounge. His glass hit the bar counter hard enough to slosh. He knew that scent. He had known it for 4 years, had fallen asleep breathing it, had pressed his face into dark hair to find it, had stood in a hospital hallway 6 months ago and understood for the first time that he would never smell it again. The woman in the corner looked up, and Kang Ji-tai's world stopped. Her face. It was her face. Not similar, not reminiscent, not the cruel trick of grief that makes a stranger's profile look familiar for half a second on a crowded street. It was her face, the exact geometry of it, the wide-set dark eyes, the particular shape of her mouth, the line of her jaw, everything. Looking back at him from across the room with an expression of startled uncertainty that said she'd finally registered she was not alone in here. The dustpan dropped from her hand. Glass scattered again across the floor. Jitai didn't move. He wasn't sure he was breathing. Some part of his mind was trying to construct rational explanations. Grief-induced hallucination, the whiskey, the lighting, and some other part of him, deeper and less manageable, was simply flooding with a recognition so total it bypassed language entirely. She got to her feet carefully, one hand on the wall, and took a step back. Her eyes were wide, and she was looking at him the way a person looks at something they cannot categorize. Not recognition, he registered that immediately, not a mirror of what he was feeling. Just the wariness of a woman who had been alone in a room and had suddenly discovered she wasn't. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice. Lower than he remembered, maybe, or maybe that was his memory playing with him. I didn't I knocked. I thought the room was empty. I'll come back. She reached for the dustpan. Wait. The word came out of him rough and barely controlled, stripped of the authority it usually carried, just a raw imperative. He moved around the bar without deciding to. Wait, don't move. She went very still, but her eyes tracked to the door and back, calculating, and he understood that she was frightened and that his tone hadn't helped. He stopped moving, made himself stop, put his hands at his sides and stood there in the middle of the room and tried to find words that made any sense. What's your name? He said. She was quiet a moment, weighing things he couldn't see. Amara, she said finally. Amara Brooks. Brooks. Her name, Naomi's name, had been Brooks before they married, before she'd become Naomi Brooks Kang. He stood with that coincidence sitting in his sternum like something with weight. How long have you worked here? 2 weeks. Still watching him carefully. Her hand had moved to rest against her abdomen in the unconscious protective gesture he'd seen pregnant women make, the body's instinct to put itself between danger and what it carried. I came through the staffing agency. If there's a problem with my work, there's no problem. He was looking at her face and trying to reconcile the looking with what his mind was insisting. The scar. He searched for it. Naomi had a small scar above her left eyebrow, faded and old, from a fall she'd taken as a child. He found it. Or he thought he found it. The light was low and he was 3 drinks in, and he needed to be careful about what he thought he was seeing. You're looking at me like you know me, Amara said, and her voice had steadied, a careful flatness coming into it that wasn't hostility exactly, but was clear about its own limits. I'm sorry. He took a breath. The scent was still there, stronger now that she was standing, real and precise and destroying him quietly. I apologize. You remind me of someone. People say that sometimes. She said it in a way that suggested this had happened before, recently, and that she found it disorienting rather than flattering. I wouldn't know. I don't have a lot of reference points. Something in the phrasing caught him. What does that mean? She looked at him for a moment. Then she crouched carefully, retrieved the dustpan, and began collecting the scattered glass again with movements that said she was done with the conversation and returning to the transaction of work. It means I should finish this and let you have your room back, sir. Jite stood in the middle of the lounge and watched her work, and felt his hands shaking in a way they hadn't in 6 months, and understood that whatever tonight had been before this moment, it was over now, and something else had started. He didn't sleep. He sat in the back of the car on the way back to the estate and stared at the partition between himself and the driver and replayed those 3 minutes with a precision that hadn't been available to him in months. The face, the scent, the scar, the name. Brooks, not Kang, just Brooks, as if the second half had been removed. The way she'd held herself. The pregnancy that sat visibly advanced, 7 months at least by the look of it, maybe more. 7 months. 6 months since the bombing. He did that math in the car and sat very still with the result of it for the remaining 12 minutes of the drive home. Sungjin was waiting at the estate. Of course he was. Sungjin was always there, had been there since Jite was 26 and just taking over from his father, had been the one person Jite trusted to hold the organization steady during the worst of the grief months. 40 years old, calm in a way that read as wisdom, loyal in a way that had never given Jite reason to question it. He was standing in the entrance hall when Jite came through the door, reading something on his phone, and he looked up with the attentive neutrality of a man accustomed to reading his employer's state and adjusting accordingly. Jite looked at him. I need everything you can find on the cleaning staff at the club. Sungjin's expression didn't change. All of them? One of them. New hire. 2 weeks. Name is Amara Brooks. She came through a staffing agency. He started up the stairs. I need it by morning. Full background, whatever the agency has. If the agency's records are thin, I need to know why. Understood. A pause. Jite. He stopped on the 3rd step. Didn't turn around. You don't look good, Sungjin said. Not a criticism. An observation, offered carefully. One of the small privileges of 8 years of proximity. When did you last sleep more than a few hours? Get me what I asked for. He went upstairs. He sat in his study with the lights low and his phone face down on the desk, and thought about Naomi. Not the way he usually thought about her. The grief loop, the replaying of the last time he'd seen her alive, the morning of the bombing, her standing in the kitchen of this house, drinking coffee she made too strong, telling him something about a doctor's appointment she had scheduled for the following week. He thought about her with more intention now. Specifics. Her face. Her voice. The way she moved. He was building a comparison in his head, and the comparison was doing something to his chest that wasn't entirely pain. Naomi had been 29 when she died. She'd been American, second-generation Nigerian-American, born in Atlanta, had come to Seoul on a graduate program and met Jitai at a function neither of them had wanted to attend. They'd been together 3 years and married for 1, and the marriage had been complicated, because all things in his life were complicated, because marrying the head of the Baeko syndicate came with complications that no amount of love could fully smooth over, and they'd been navigating those complications with the careful honesty of 2 people who had decided to choose each other anyway. She'd been pregnant. 8 weeks, the doctor had told him afterward, when he'd asked with the hollow automatic thoroughness of a man still going through the motions of finding out things that no longer mattered. The woman downstairs was 7 months pregnant. He put his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands. Cheb. Sungjin had the file on his desk by 6 in the morning. Jitai hadn't slept. He'd changed his shirt sometime around 4 and made coffee he didn't drink, and sat with the dark outside his window gradually lightening and thought. And when the folder appeared, he opened it immediately and read with the slow, deliberate attention he gave to things that mattered. Amara Brooks, 28 years old. American citizen, no Korean residency visa on record. And that was the first anomaly, because she was working legally and the staffing agency had her documentation on file. But the documentation itself had gaps. No employment history prior to 7 months ago. No residential address prior to 7 months ago. The earliest verifiable record was a hospital admission in Incheon 7 months ago, under the name Jane Doe, admitted after being found unresponsive near the waterfront. She'd been treated for a severe head injury and what the records described as significant psychological trauma. She'd regained consciousness after 11 days. She'd had no identification. She'd been unable to provide her name or any personal history, and after a period of several weeks in hospital care and subsequent evaluation, she had been given the name she'd offered spontaneously, Amara, and the surname Brooks from a book she'd been reading during recovery. The attending social worker had noted in an almost apologetic addendum. Jitae read that section twice. She remembered nothing. The medical notes were careful and comprehensive. Enterograde function intact, language fully preserved, personality and affect within normal range. But retrograde memory prior to the day she'd been found was absent. Not incomplete, not patchy. Gone. A 7-month blank where a life should have been. 7 months ago. 1 month before the bombing. He set the folder down, picked it up again, put it down. The pregnancy was documented in the hospital records. She'd been approximately 5 to 6 weeks along when she was admitted. 7 months ago. He did the timeline forward and arrived at the same place he'd arrived in the car the night before, and this time he let himself sit with it without flinching. The baby was his, or the baby was Naomi's, which was the same thing, which was, he didn't have language for what that was. He called Sung Jin. "I need Han Jae-won." Sung Jin's voice was careful. "The doctor? And I need it quiet. I need him here today, not at his office. No records, no appointments. I'll explain when he arrives." He paused. "And I need a team on Amara Brooks by tonight. Discreet. I want to know when she leaves, when she sleeps, when she eats. She's not to be touched or approached. She's not to know she's being watched. Can I ask what's happening?" Jitai was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, Seoul was waking up. The gray early light breaking over the rooftops, the first sounds of traffic. Somewhere across the city, a woman named Amara Brooks, who might have once been named something else, was probably sleeping, carrying a child whose father was sitting in a study in the hills with a coffee he hadn't touched, and a dead wife's file open on his desk. "Not yet," Jitai said. "Give me a few more hours." Oh. Han Jae-won arrived at the estate at noon and listened to Jitai speak for 11 minutes without interrupting, which was a quality Jitai had always appreciated in him. He was 60 years old, a former trauma surgeon turned private practitioner, and he had been the Beko Syndicate's physician for long enough to have developed the professional composure necessary for conversations that started with sentences like the one Ji-Tai had just finished. "You think your wife survived," Chae-won said. Not a question, not judgment, just a careful restatement delivered in the flat register of a man sorting out what he was being asked to do. "I think there's a woman who looks exactly like my wife, carries my wife's family name before marriage, has no memory prior to a date 1 month before the bombing, and appears to be 7 to 8 months pregnant." Ji-tae's voice was level. He'd decided sometime in the last sleepless night that he was going to be level about this. Falling apart was a thing he'd already done. He didn't have the resources to do it again before he knew what was real. "I need to know if it's possible. A false identification was made 6 months ago. The identification was based on a ring and partial dental records. The remains were... there wasn't much to work with." Chae-won was quiet, thinking. If someone wanted to fake her death, then they would have needed a body that matched well enough to pass identification under those conditions. Ji-tae looked at the desk. "Which is not a simple thing to arrange, but it's not impossible. For the right people. What do you want from me?" "I want you to examine her. Medically, the pregnancy, her health, everything. I need the pregnancy dated with precision, and if you can obtain a DNA sample without her knowledge, that's not something I'm willing to do without consent." Ji-tae looked up at him. The look lasted a moment. "Fair enough. But if she consents to an examination, and if as part of that examination she consents to standard prenatal testing, arrange it." Ji-tae stood. "I'll get her to agree to it. Tell her it's a wellness program for club employees, something that costs her nothing." Chae-won picked up his bag. "And if the test confirms what you're thinking," Ji-tae walked to the window. Below, the grounds of the estate stretched toward the ridge, the trees that Naomi had said she wanted to plant more of, the kitchen garden she'd sketched plans for on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before she'd died. Plans he'd found in a drawer afterward and sat with for an hour without being able to throw them away. "Then I figure out what happened to my wife," he said. "And I figure out who made it happen." Jets. Getting Amara to agree to the examination took longer than he'd expected, because Amara Brooks was not a woman who agreed to things easily. He didn't approach her directly. Not yet. That was its own calculation, its own restraint that cost him. Instead, he had the club's general manager reach out through official channels, framing it as a new employee health program, fully voluntary, provided at no cost through a physician retained by the club. Several employees had signed up. The manager had mentioned it to Amara in passing, low pressure, nothing that required a decision on the spot. She'd declined once. Then agreed 2 days later, the manager reported, under the condition that she be allowed to bring a question list and that everything be fully explained before anything was done. Ji-tae had smiled at that, alone in his car, the first real expression that had crossed his face in weeks. That was exactly the kind of thing Naomi would have done. He watched the examination through a monitor in an adjacent room, something he did not examine too closely, the ethics of, while Jae-won worked with the careful, respectful competence that made him worth what he was paid. Amara was composed and specific. She asked good questions. She was not easily managed or redirected when she wanted information, and she pushed back twice on things that seemed unclear. And each time Chae-won answered her honestly, and she accepted the answers and moved forward. Her prenatal history was consistent with what Ji-tae had projected. 32 weeks, due in approximately 2 months. The fetus was healthy by every available measure, positioned well, development normal, heartbeat strong. 32 weeks ago placed conception at almost exactly the time of the bombing. Chae-won obtained blood for standard prenatal panels. He also, with Amara's consent, ran a genetic ancestry screen, presented as a standard health service, which technically it was. Ji-tae sat with the preliminary report in his hands 3 days later in the study, at the same desk where he'd read the file, and looked at the section on ancestry markers, and understood with the certainty of a man looking at data rather than hope that the woman working nights in the basement of his nightclub had the same genetic ancestry profile as Naomi Brooks Kang, his wife, whose remains he had been shown in a white room in a Seoul hospital 6 months ago and confirmed is real. He sat with that for a long time. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out the DNA file Jae-won had flagged as a separate item, a result that had required an extra day to process and had arrived with a note that said simply, paternity confirmed. The fetus shares your genetic profile at the level consistent with biological father. Jitai put the paper down flat on the desk and pressed his palm on top of it and stared at the wall and breathed. His wife was alive. She didn't know who she was. She was carrying his child. She was sweeping broken glass in the basement of his nightclub for an hourly wage and living somewhere across the city in circumstances he didn't yet know. And she had no idea that any of this was true. And someone had done this to her. Someone had arranged a bombing, arranged a body, arranged a false identification, and put Naomi out in the world with no name and no memory and no protection, while Jitai spent 6 months drowning in manufactured grief. The question was who, and the question beneath that was why. He picked up his phone and called Sung Jin. Tomorrow morning. I want the full reconstruction of the bombing. Everything we compiled in the first 2 months. Physical evidence, source reports, everything. And I want it in the conference room at 8, not in my study. I want the team there. I'll arrange it. A pause. Has something changed? Jite looked at the paper under his hand. Yes, he said. Something's changed. He hung up without explaining and sat for another hour in the study with the confirmation that his wife was alive and the growing cold weight of understanding that someone had wanted him to believe otherwise, and that person had been close enough to make it convincing. He began making a list. It was the thing he did when grief tried to turn into chaos. He made lists, organized information into structure, gave the uncontrollable a shape he could work with. The list of people who had known about Naomi's pregnancy. The list of people who'd had access to the investigation in the immediate aftermath. The list of people who would have had the resources and the network to arrange what had been arranged. The list was not long. It had never been a large circle. He looked at the names and thought about each one. The way you thought about a familiar room when you've been told something in it isn't where you left it. Looking for the thing that's moved. The name near the top of the list, the name that appeared on every sublist, every category, every question about access and knowledge and capability, was one he'd written there without letting himself think about what it meant. Seo Min Kyu. He looked at the name for a long time. Then he closed the notebook and went to find Amara Brooks, because whatever came next, he couldn't let her spend another night without knowing someone was watching over her, even if she couldn't know who that someone was, or why, or what he knew about the life she'd lost and could not remember. She was in the basement corridor when he found her, just coming off shift, her cleaning cart parked against the wall and her coat half on, struggling slightly with the zipper on account of the pregnancy making the geometry difficult. She looked up when she heard him, and the wariness came back immediately. That same careful flatness from the first night, the way she arranged herself when she wasn't sure of a situation. Jite stopped a reasonable distance away. He'd thought about this. He'd thought about what to say and how to say it, and had discarded a dozen versions that were either too much or not enough. The wellness program, he said. Dr. Han said your appointment went well. She looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. You're the owner. Yes. Nobody told me the owner had access to employee health records. He didn't share records. He told me you came in. That's all. It wasn't entirely true. He held it steadily. I wanted to make sure it was useful. Amar considered him. The zipper was still half done, and she wasn't going to deal with it while he was watching. He could see her make that decision. It was fine, she said. He was thorough. He explained things clearly. Good. He paused. I also wanted to say, the other night, I made you uncomfortable, the way I looked at you. He said it plainly, without dressing it up, because plain was the only register that felt like it would land with her. I'm sorry for that. She looked at him for a moment. The wariness didn't dissolve. Yeah, it was too well-founded for that, but something in it shifted slightly. You said I reminded you of someone. Yes. Someone important. He held the eye contact. Yes. She nodded once, slowly, in the way of a person who has decided to accept an explanation without fully believing it. Then she went back to the zipper and got it the rest of the way, and pulled her coat straight and picked up her bag. I should get going. Let me arrange a car, he said. The neighborhood, it's late, and I take the bus. Flat, immediate. I've been taking the bus, I'm fine. He let it go. He wasn't going to push tonight, wasn't going to give her any reason to see him as a threat, because the thing that would protect Naomi, the thing that would protect both of them, was keeping the thread between them from breaking before he understood what he was dealing with. He'd have a car follow the bus. He'd have a team on her building by morning. She'd be safe without knowing she was safe, and he'd carry that weight the same way he'd been carrying everything for 6 months, alone, in the dark, with both hands. She walked past him toward the exit. He stood in the corridor and watched her go, watched the careful way she moved, watched the set of her shoulders and the pace of her step, and the recognition moved through him again like a current, bone deep, wordless, the kind of certainty that lives below the level of argument. At the far end of the corridor, she pushed through the exit door. It swung shut behind her. Jite stood in the empty corridor for a long moment, listening to the bass from the floors above, the club still in full motion, 200 people living their uncomplicated lives inside the building his family had built. Then he took out his phone and called the one man he trusted most in the world and said, "I need to meet tomorrow, alone, clear your morning." And Min-kyu said, "Of course, whatever you need, I'm there." The way he always did, the way he'd always done, for 8 years of unquestioned loyalty. Jite said goodnight and hung up. He stood there a moment longer. Then, for the first time in 6 months, he began to wonder whether the man who answered that phone was the same man he had always believed him to be. The meeting with Min-kyu lasted 40 minutes and told Jite nothing he didn't already know, which was itself a kind of information. They sat across from each other in the East Conference Room of the Baiko Administrative Building, a room with no windows, good soundproofing, and a table long enough that 2 men sitting at one end of it still had to make a small decision about how close to sit. Jitai had arrived first, which he'd done deliberately, because he wanted to be already seated and settled when Min-kyu walked in, wanted to watch the entrance from a position of stillness rather than motion. Old habit. The kind of thing you learned when the people you met with regularly were people capable of killing you. Min-kyu came in at 8:03, which was 3 minutes late, which was unlike him. He was 40 years old, built like a man who had spent his 30s doing the physical work of the syndicate rather than delegating it, broad through the shoulders, thick-necked, with a face that had taken enough damage over the years to look distinguished in the specific way that scar tissue sometimes achieved. He'd been Jitai's underboss for 4 years, his lieutenant for 4 years before that. He'd been at the hospital the night of the bombing. He'd been the one who'd driven Jitai home afterward, who'd sat with him in the car outside the estate for 20 minutes when Jitai couldn't make himself go inside. He pulled out the chair across from Jitai and sat and poured himself water from the carafe on the table, and his hands were steady, and his face was the face Jitai had looked at for 8 years, open enough, attentive, carrying the slight permanent tension of a man always running calculations just below the surface of whatever expression he was wearing. "You look like hell," Min-kyu said, not unkindly. "You're 3 minutes late. Traffic." He settled back. "What's happening?" Jite looked at him for a moment without speaking. He'd been doing this more since last night, looking at familiar things and trying to see them without the familiarity filtering out the detail. It was a disorienting exercise, like trying to read a word you'd read so many times it had stopped looking like a word. "I want to go back over the bombing investigation," Jite said. Something moved across Min-kyu's face, small and quickly managed, and it could have been anything. Could have been the natural response of a man being asked to revisit a painful subject. Could have been fatigue. Could have been something else entirely. We went over it. We went over it for 2 months. We identified the Red Crane people. We identified who we were told to identify. Jite said it evenly. "I want to go back to the source material, the physical evidence from the scene, the original forensics." Min-kyu was quiet for 3 seconds. Jite counted them. "Why now?" "Because I'm not satisfied." He held Min-kyu's gaze. "I've never been satisfied. I let the operational response push out the investigative work because there was pressure to move, and I was not in a position to resist that pressure. I'm in a different position now." "You were grieving." "I was grieving. I'm done grieving." He said it flatly, the way he'd say anything that was simply a fact. "I want the original forensics. I want them pulled, and I want Jaewon to review the identification documentation independently." Min-kyu's jaw shifted. "That's..." He stopped, rerouted. That's going to open things up. People are going to ask questions about why we're going back. Let them ask. Jite. He leaned forward. His voice dropped. Got careful. I understand needing to be sure. I do. But dragging this back up, at this point, when the organization is finally stabilized after 6 months of, we destroyed 2 rival operations, we're 3 weeks from closing the Busan port arrangement. If you start publicly questioning the investigation, I said I want the files, Min-Kyu. The authority in it was quiet. The kind of quiet that was worse than volume. I didn't ask for a cost-benefit analysis. The room sat in silence for a moment. Min-Kyu leaned back. Something had settled over his face. A different arrangement of the same features, something more closed. I'll have them pulled, he said. Today. Today. He stood, straightened his jacket. Anything else? Jite looked at him. Not right now. Min-Kyu nodded once and walked out. Jite sat in the empty conference room and listened to the silence and thought about the 3-second pause and the rerouted sentence and the specific argument that had been deployed against going back to the investigation. Not, there's nothing to find, but it will cost us too much to look. The distinction felt important. Turned it over in his mind the way you'd turn a stone looking for what lived underneath it. He sat there for a long time. Amara had a routine, and within 4 days, Jite's team had mapped it with the kind of thoroughness he'd requested. She woke early. The surveillance noted lights on in her apartment by 6 most mornings. The apartment was a small 1-bedroom in Mapo-gu, 3rd floor of a building with adequate but not good security, the kind of place a person landed when they were rebuilding from nothing and needed to spend the minimum that still felt safe. She took the bus to a morning shift at a different cleaning contract, a commercial office building in Yoido, 3 days a week, and the club shifts 4 nights a week. And she had a prenatal appointment every other Thursday at a clinic in Hongdae she reached on foot because it was only 12 minutes from the apartment. She didn't appear to have friends in Seoul. She had a phone, a modest one, prepaid, and the surveillance team had confirmed through the building's lobby camera records that she received no visitors and appeared to go out only for work and appointments and occasional grocery runs, the latter accomplished with the careful economy of someone managing a tight budget and a body that was getting harder to move through a crowded store. Jite read the daily reports and felt a specific grinding guilt that he tried to be functional about. She was alone. She was alone and pregnant, and she didn't know why. And the answer to why was sitting in a study in the hills running surveillance on her instead of explaining any of it, because explaining it required information he didn't yet have, and trust she had no reason to give him, and a version of the truth that he wasn't confident he could deliver without shattering something that needed to stay intact. He approached her on a Thursday. He'd chosen a Thursday because the club was quieter, because she'd just come off the early shift in Yoido and was tired in a way that might make her more receptive to the kind of practical offer he was planning to make, and because he'd spent 3 days running scenarios and none of them had produced a better entry point. He found her in the break room off the basement corridor, sitting at the small table with her shoes off and her feet up on the adjacent chair and a paper cup of something hot held in both hands. She looked up when he came through the door and put her feet down and started to stand. "Don't," he said. "You don't need to do that." She stayed half upright for a moment, suspended between courtesy and discomfort, then settled back into the chair with the careful movements of someone for whom standing and sitting had become negotiations. "Mr. Kang." "Jite." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, which he'd also thought about, coming to her level, not standing over her, removing whatever physical authority came with height and the suit that cost more than her monthly rent. Or just Kang, if you prefer. Whatever's easier. She looked at him with that steady, measuring quality. "What can I do for you?" "I have a proposal." He put his hands flat on the table. "Nothing complicated. The estate, my residence, outside the city, has staff accommodation. It's separate from the main house. Fully private, 2 bedrooms. It's been empty for some time. The position would be officially classified as household staff. The work would be light, and genuinely light, not the kind of thing that gets reclassified once you're there. The accommodation is rent-free. There's a car available for appointments." Amara was quiet. She looked at him over her paper cup, and the look was not the reaction he might have hoped for. Not relief or consideration, but a very calm, very direct suspicion. Why? Because you're 32 weeks pregnant, working 2 jobs, living alone in a third-floor apartment with no elevator, and taking a bus to your prenatal appointments. He said it without inflection. It's a practical problem with a practical solution. I have the space. And you make housing offers to pregnant employees routinely. No. So what's actually happening here? He looked at her. He'd decided, somewhere in the sleepless math of the past few days, that he would not lie to her directly. He would omit. He would withhold the things she wasn't ready to hear and that he wasn't ready to prove. But he would not look at her face, Naomi's face, and deliberately say things that weren't true. You remind me of someone I lost, he said. I'm aware that's not an explanation that makes the offer reasonable. I'm also aware that from where you're sitting, a man who owns the building you work in offering you a place to live looks like exactly the kind of situation a person in your position should be careful about. He paused. I'm asking you to consider it anyway. You can have Dr. Hahn's contact information as a reference. You can set whatever conditions you need. You can leave whenever you want. Amara put her cup down on the table. She looked at her hands for a moment. Strong hands, the kind of hands that had been doing physical work for months, the knuckles slightly dry. Then she looked up. I'm not someone who takes things from people I don't understand. That's reasonable. I've been managing fine. I believe you. I don't need... She stopped. Her jaw tightened for a moment with something that might have been the edge of tears, or might have been anger, and she handled it the way she seemed to handle most things, which was to press it back down and keep her face level. I don't need someone deciding I can't take care of myself. I'm not deciding that. His voice was very quiet. You can absolutely take care of yourself. You've been doing it for 7 months with no support and no history and no one who knew you before. And you've built a functional life out of nothing, and that's not a small thing. He held her gaze. I'm not offering because I think you can't manage. I'm offering because you shouldn't have to manage alone. The break room was small enough that the silence had texture. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was complicated. The suspicion still there, but something else moving under it. Something that might have been the acknowledgement of exhaustion. The thing a person felt when they'd been alone for long enough that having it named out loud did something involuntary to their face. I'll think about it, she said finally. It was more than he'd expected. That's all I'm asking. He stood. She watched him, and he caught the moment when her eyes went to his hands, the still split knuckles, 3 weeks now without healing because he kept reopening them. And something crossed her face that was close to recognition of something, though not the recognition he was waiting for. Those need to be bandaged, she said. Not warm, not cold, just factual. Jite looked at his hand. I know. You should do something about it. I will. He left her in the break room and went back upstairs and stood in the corridor outside his office and put his back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly through his nose. His hands were steady. They were always steady when they needed to be. That was the thing about the steady hands. They worked when required and fell apart at 3 in the morning when no one was watching, and he'd made a private accommodation with that. His phone buzzed. Sung Jin. The original forensics. You need to see this tonight. Wow. The files were spread across the conference table when Jitai arrived at 9 that evening. Sung Jin was already there, and the syndicate's head of intelligence, a woman named Oh Yeon-soo, who was 43 and had the permanent stillness of someone who had learned that showing reaction was a resource expenditure, was standing at the far end of the table with a folder open in her hands. Yeon-soo had been the one to pull the files. She was one of the 3 people Jitai had decided to trust with the secondary investigation for the time being because she'd had no direct role in the original investigation, and her loyalty had a quality that was structural rather than personal. She was loyal to the organization's integrity, which meant she was loyal to accuracy, which was what he needed right now. Tell me, Jitai said. Yeon-soo set down her folder. The dental records used for the primary identification. She put a document on the table in front of him. These were provided by a dental clinic in Seodamun. I contacted the clinic this afternoon, independently, as a records request. And? The clinic has no record of treating a patient with Naomi Brooks Kang's name. No record of her ever having been a patient there. The records that were provided to the identification team 6 months ago List a patient ID number that doesn't exist in the clinic's system. She paused. The clinic manager was cooperative. She pulled their archive going back 5 years. There is no match. The room was quiet. Jitay put his hands flat on the table. He looked at the document. The original investigation team received these records. Yes. Who received them, specifically? Yeonsu looked at him steadily. They were processed by Min-Kyu's administrative team. Standard protocol. All external documentation was routed through the underboss office during the investigation phase. Jitay breathed slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way he'd trained himself in situations where the thing he was feeling and the thing he needed to project had to stay on opposite sides of a wall. What else? Yeonsu picked up a second document. The forensic team's final report. There's a chain of custody gap in the physical evidence from the bomb site. There are items logged at the scene that were never logged into the evidence storage, including... She paused, and it was the first pause she'd taken, the first small concession to the weight of what she was saying, including the ring. The ring, the thin gold band with the small inset stone, the object he'd been shown in a white room and had said yes to, had said that's her to, had built 6 months of grief on top of. Where is the ring now? It's in evidence storage, but the logging timestamp doesn't match the scene documentation. There's a 5-hour gap. She set the document down. Someone logged it in after the fact. Jitay stood very still. The temperature of the room hadn't changed, but something about it felt different. The air, the quality of the silence, the specific way that a space feels when the thing you've been looking for is no longer theoretical. Sungjin had been quiet throughout. He spoke now, carefully. Jitay, who had access to evidence storage during that 5-hour window? His voice was flat and very controlled, and Sungjin heard the control in it and stopped. Yeonsu pulled a third document. She put it on the table without speaking and took a step back. Jitay looked at it. It was a security log. Badge access records for the evidence storage facility, date stamped from the night of the bombing. There were 3 entries during the 5-hour window. 2 were members of the forensic team, both logged for routine procedures. The third name was Seo Min-Kyu. Jitay stood with his hands on the table and looked at the name of the man he had trusted most in the world, and felt something happen in his chest that was not grief, and was not surprise, and was not anger, not yet, but was the specific cold sensation of a certainty that had been building for days, arriving at its final form. He'd been right. He'd sat in the study and written a list and seen the name at the top, and told himself it was paranoia, told himself that grief made you see enemies in familiar faces, told himself that 8 years of loyalty was evidence. He'd been right. Nobody talks about this, he said. His voice had gone very quiet. Yeonsu, Sungjin, nothing leaves this room. Nobody approaches Min-Kyu. Nobody acts differently. Nobody changes their routine with him. Is that understood? Yes, Yeonsu said. Sungjin was looking at him with an expression that contained several things and was not releasing any of them. What are you going to do? Jitay straightened up from the table. He picked up the security log and looked at it one more time. Min-Kyu's name in standard black type, time-stamped and logged, as ordinary as a grocery list, as devastating as a confession. I'm going to make sure she's safe first, he said, and then I'm going to find out everything. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Get me a full record of Min-Kyu's movements and communications for the 3 months prior to the bombing. Everything. Phone records, financial transfers, meeting logs. I want it clean and I want it documented, because when this ends, I want it to end completely. He went out into the corridor. The walk back to the elevator was 30 seconds. He made it in 30 seconds and stepped in and pressed the button for the ground floor and stood in the small metal box as it descended and let his face do what it needed to do, alone in the elevator where no one could see it. He'd learned that early. Give it somewhere private, give it its 30 seconds, and then put it back. The doors opened. He walked out into the night. Amara called the number he'd left her at 11:47 that same night. He was still awake. He was always still awake at 11:47. That was just the geography of his nights now. He picked up on the second ring and said her name, and she said nothing for a moment, and he waited. The second bedroom, she said finally. You said 2 bedrooms. Yes. And I can leave whenever I want. No conditions. No conditions. Another pause. He could hear her breathing, slightly elevated the way a person breathed when they'd made a decision and were still making peace with it. Okay, she said. I have things here. I'll need to pack. I'll send a car in the morning, whenever you're ready. She was quiet for a moment, then, why are you still awake? The question was unexpected. He looked at the ceiling of his study. I usually am. That's not healthy. No, he agreed. It's not. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, wasn't quite dismissive. Something in between, something human and unstudied that hit him somewhere behind the sternum in a way he wasn't prepared for. All right, she said. I'll be ready at 9. She hung up. Jite sat in his chair and looked at the phone in his hand and thought about Naomi. Not the grief version, not the hospital version, but the kitchen on a Tuesday version, the too strong coffee version, the version who said exactly what she thought in exactly the words she needed and no more. And then he put the phone on the desk and picked up the security log again and looked at Min-kyu's name. Two things were true at once, and he needed to hold both of them. The woman he loved was alive and moving into his home tomorrow morning, and the man who had taken her from him was still sitting at his right hand, still running operations on his behalf, still answering his calls with, of course, whatever you need, I'm there, and didn't yet know that Jitai knew. The moment Jitai moved against Min-kyu, Min-kyu would know the investigation had turned. And a man who had already demonstrated he was willing to arrange a car bombing and a fabricated death and 7 months of suffering was a man who, when cornered, would not. The sentence he hadn't finished sat in the room like a live thing. Jitai put the security log face down on the desk and stood up and walked to the window and looked at the dark grounds below and let the unfinished thought complete itself in the silence where no one could hear it. A man who had already arranged a car bombing would not hesitate to finish what he'd started if he understood he'd been found out. Which meant Amara could not be in that apartment in Mapogu when Min-kyu realized the investigation had turned. Which meant morning wasn't soon enough. He called Sung-jin at 12:15. The car I'm sending for Amara Brooks tomorrow. Move it to tonight. Now. I need her out of that apartment in the next 2 hours. Sung-jin was quiet for a beat. It's past midnight. I'm aware of the time. She agreed to tomorrow morning. If you send a car tonight without warning, she's going to call her first. Tell her there's been a change. Tell her I apologize for the hour. Tell her the car is a courtesy and she can refuse it. He was already moving, pulling his jacket from the back of the chair. But get her out of there tonight, Sung-jin. I need her inside the estate walls before I make any other move. He heard Sung-jin processing that. Not the words, but the weight behind them. The specific register of urgency that Jitai almost never used. Understood, Sung-jin said. I'll call her now. Jitai hung up and stood in the study for a moment with his jacket half on and his mind running the geometry of the situation. Min-kyu didn't know yet. That was the only advantage he had, and it was temporary and fragile, and the moment it was gone, the entire situation changed shape. He needed to know everything before that happened. He needed to know why. Amara was awake when the call came. That was the first thing Sung-jin reported back. She'd answered on the first ring, voice clear, no sleep in it, which meant she'd been lying in the dark the same way Jite had been sitting in the study, awake with the decision she'd made and the unfamiliar weight of it. She'd agreed to the car without argument, which told Jitai something about her own instincts, that some part of her had already understood the apartment wasn't as safe as the third floor, and the adequate but not good security had made it feel. She arrived at the estate at 1:40 in the morning with a single large bag and the careful composure of a woman who had taught herself not to show how tired she was. Jitai met her in the entrance hall. He'd thought about whether to do that, whether it was too much, and decided that having her walk to the guest accommodation by a staff member she'd never met at 2 in the morning would be worse. She looked at him and at the entrance hall and at the scale of the house with one long, level look that took everything in and revealed very little. You didn't have to wait up, she said. I wasn't sleeping. You said that before. It keeps being true. She almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but the shape of it was there for a moment, and he filed it away with the involuntary precision of a man cataloging things he wasn't allowing himself to want yet. He showed her to the guest wing himself, down the east corridor, separate entrance from the main house, the 2 bedrooms, and the small sitting room that had been prepared that afternoon when he'd still believed tomorrow morning was the timeline. She stood in the doorway of the larger bedroom and looked at it, and he could see her doing the math of it, the distance between this and the Mapogu apartment, the distance between this and whatever she'd imagined her life would look like, when she'd been found on a waterfront in Incheon 7 months ago with no name and no past. "It's too much," she said. "It's a room." "It's not just a room." She turned to look at him. Her eyes in the low light were very direct, the kind of direct that came from a person who'd had to read situations accurately to survive them. "What are you not telling me?" He held the look. "Several things," he said. "None of them tonight." She studied him for a moment. "That's honest, at least." "I'm trying to be." She turned back to the room. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." And he understood that the okay wasn't about the room or the accommodation or even him specifically. It was a woman making an internal settlement with a situation she couldn't fully see, deciding to trust the available evidence rather than the fear, and it cost her something to do it, and he watched her do it and felt the guilt of the withheld information settle deeper into his chest. "If you need anything," he said, "any hour. I'll be fine." "I know you will." He paused in the doorway. "Good night, Amara." She didn't answer immediately, then quietly, "Good night." He went back to his study and didn't sleep. The full picture of what Min-kyu had done arrived in pieces over the following 72 hours, assembled by Yeon-soo and a small team working in a secured room on the 2nd floor of the administrative building with access to records that Min-kyu didn't know they were pulling. The financial thread came first. Yeon-soo found it in a subsidiary account, a cleaning company that existed on paper, registered 18 months ago, that had received a series of transfers from an external source Ji-tae didn't immediately recognize. She traced the external source through 2 shell structures and found the origin, a private security contractor with documented connections to a fixers network that operated across 3 countries. The contractor's known services included, among other things, the procurement and preparation of unidentifiable remains for forensic substitution purposes. Ji-tae read that line twice. Then he set the report down and went and stood at the window of the secured room and put his forehead against the glass and breathed for 60 seconds. Someone had been sourced. A body. A woman. Approximate age, approximate build, approximate dental profile. Close enough that under the conditions of a car bombing, and the grief-impaired judgment of a man being shown a ring and told to confirm his wife's identity, it had been close enough. He went back to the table and kept reading. The communication records were more fragmentary, but Yeon-soo had been patient and systematic, and what she'd reconstructed showed a pattern beginning approximately 3 months before the bombing. Min-kyu had been in contact, through burner channels, through intermediaries, with someone inside the organization who had been feeding information about Naomi's movements, her schedule, her route to and from the clinic where she'd begun her prenatal care, the car she used, the driver she trusted. The bombing had not been random. It had been timed. It had been planned with knowledge that could only have come from inside the estate. And 2 weeks before the bombing, there was something else. Yeon-soo had flagged it with a single handwritten note on the margin of the document. "This is the part you need to sit down for." Ji-tae was already sitting. The document was a medical record. Not Naomi's prenatal records, but a private consultation record from a clinic in Gangnam, patient name redacted, date 18 months prior. The consultation had been with a neurological specialist. The notes described a patient presenting for evaluation of a family member. The family member was described as suffering from a recent psychological episode. The patient requesting the consultation on behalf of the family member was logged under an alias. But the contact number on the file, the callback number provided at registration, was a number Yeon-soo had cross-referenced against the communication records. It was a number that traced back to Min-kyu's secondary phone. Ji-tae looked at the date again. 18 months ago, 8 months before the bombing, before Naomi had been pregnant, before any of it. Min-kyu had been planning for at least 18 months. He sat with that long enough to feel the full dimension of it. Not just the betrayal of the act, but the timeline of the betrayal. The 18 months of sitting across tables, driving in cars, taking calls, holding vigils at hospitals, driving Jitai home from the identification and sitting outside the estate for 20 minutes while Jitai couldn't move. All of it performed. All of it deliberate and premeditated and sustained with a patience that required a coldness. Jitai hadn't known was possible in someone he'd eaten dinner with, argued with, trusted with the organization's most sensitive operations. 8 years. 8 years of loyalty that had apparently been something else from the start, or had curdled into something else along the way, and Jitai hadn't seen it. He'd sat across from it every day and hadn't seen it. He thought about the morning of the bombing. He'd been at the administrative building for an early meeting. Naomi had been, he could see her exactly. The kitchen, the coffee, the doctor's appointment she'd mentioned. She'd kissed him before he left, brief and warm, and he'd been distracted, already thinking about the meeting, and he hadn't. He hadn't held it long enough. That was the thing he came back to, always. He hadn't held it long enough. She'd gotten in the car an hour after he'd left for the building. The driver was one of his trusted people. The driver had survived the bombing, badly injured, and had been in hospital for 3 weeks. Jitai had visited. He'd assumed the driver was a victim. He picked up the report again, turned to the page Yeon-soo had flagged near the back, read the section on the driver. Park Hyun, 12 years with the syndicate, clean record, injury consistent with close proximity to a device he hadn't known was there. But there was a payment. Yeon-soo had found it, indirect, laundered through 2 steps but traceable, made to a family account. The family account belonged to Park Hyun's younger brother, made 6 days before the bombing. The driver hadn't known about the bomb, but he'd known to stop the car at a specific location. He'd been paid to stop the car. Just stop it. Just pause there, at that particular intersection, for 30 seconds. Maybe he'd been told it was a surveillance thing, a security check, something that required no explanation because in their world things sometimes required no explanation. He'd stopped the car, and someone had been waiting. Jitai stood up from the table so abruptly that the chair went back hard against the wall. He walked to the far end of the room and put his hands on the shelf there, and stood with his back to the documents and his head down, and breathed through the thing that was trying to come up. Not grief this time, not the grief he'd been managing for 6 months, but something rawer and less organized, something that wanted to be destruction and was being held back by the thinnest membrane of operational thinking. He stood there for 2 minutes. Then he turned around and went back to the table and picked up his phone and called Yeon-soo, who answered on the first ring. "The driver," he said. "Park Hyun. Where is he now?" "Recovered. He's been back on the roster for 4 months. Currently assigned to..." A pause, the sound of checking. Min-kyu's personal detail. Of course he was. Take him off the roster, tonight, quietly. Reassignment, standard administrative reasons, nothing that flags. He kept his voice level. Flat. The wall was up, and it needed to stay up. And I need to know where Min-kyu is right now, not through official channels. I need eyes on him independently. I have someone I can task. Do it. And Yeon-soo. He paused. How much of this is documented, fully documented, the kind that doesn't need me to explain context? She understood what he was asking. 70%, maybe 75%. The financial chain is solid. The communication records have gaps, but the pattern is clear. The driver payment is documented. She paused. The hardest piece to prove formally is the motive. We can show what he did. We can't yet show on paper why. Jitai already knew the why. He'd been turning it over since the night he'd first looked at Min-kyu across the conference table and felt the air between them change. The why was power. The why was the same thing it always was in their world. The calculation a second man makes when he looks at the first man and decides the distance between them is too great or too slow to close by any other means. Min-kyu had looked at Naomi and seen weakness, had looked at the pregnancy and seen a man being pulled out of the machinery that kept them both in power, had done the cold arithmetic of removal and decided that Jitai grieving was more manageable than Jitai choosing family over empire. He'd been wrong about that. Catastrophically, fatally wrong. But he hadn't found that out yet. "Get me the rest," Jitai said. "You have 24 hours before I move." He hung up and stood in the secured room alone with the documents spread across the table and the quiet certainty of what was coming, and then something shifted at the edge of his attention. A sound from somewhere in the building, a door, footsteps in the corridor outside. And he moved to the door and opened it before he'd consciously decided to. The corridor was empty. He stood in the doorway and looked both ways and saw nothing, and told himself it was nothing, and went back inside. But the feeling stayed. The feeling of a room that had been listened to. The feeling of air that had been recently displaced by someone moving quickly away through it. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the door. He thought about the secured room. Who had access? Who knew this was where the secondary investigation was being run? Who in the administrative building could have reasonably been in this corridor at this hour? He thought about the 3-second pause in the conference room 4 days ago. The rerouted sentence, the argument against looking that hadn't been, "There's nothing to find." Jitae picked up his phone and called Sung Jin. It rang. It kept ringing, went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He stood in the secured room with the phone in his hand and felt the membrane between operational thinking and the rawer thing underneath it beginning to develop a tear, and he made himself breathe and think and not react until he had more information, because reacting wrong at this stage was the thing that got people killed. He called the gate of the administrative building. The overnight guard answered and confirmed. Sung Jin had left the building approximately 15 minutes ago. 15 minutes ago. Jitae walked back to the table and looked at the documents and thought about who, besides himself and Yeon-soo, had known this room existed. Who had known the secondary investigation had been moved here 3 days ago. Who had been told, in careful and limited terms, that Jitae was re-examining the forensics. Sung Jin. Sung Jin, who had been in every conversation since the beginning. Who had been the first person Jitae had called the morning after seeing Amara in the lounge. Who had arranged the doctor, the surveillance team, the background file, the car, every operational piece of the last 2 weeks. Who had access, by virtue of proximity, to more of Jitae's movements and intentions than almost anyone. And who was not answering his phone. Jitae gathered the documents from the table with methodical speed, not panicked, not hurried in a way that lost things, but fast, and secured them in the locked case Yeon-soo had left for exactly this contingency. And he called Yeon-soo again and said simply, "Burn the room, everything electronic, then go somewhere Min-kyu's people don't know." He was already moving. He was in the car before he'd finished processing the full weight of what Sung Jin's silence might mean, because the car was where he needed to be, moving toward the estate, toward Amara, toward the one asset in this situation that could not be allowed to become leverage. The driver pulled out of the administrative building and Jitae sat in the back and looked at his phone and called the estate's head of security and said, "Lock down the guest wing. Nobody in or out except me. If anyone you don't recognize comes through the gate, call me before you do anything else." He paused. "And check on the occupant of the east guest rooms, quietly. Don't wake her if she's sleeping. Just confirm she's there." He sat back and looked out the window at the nighttime city moving past, and thought about 18 months of patience and what it implied about the present, that a man who had planned this long and this carefully would have contingencies, would have considered the possibility of discovery, would have prepared for it. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He looked at it for a moment, answered. Silence on the line, and then a voice. Sung Jin's voice, lower than usual, careful in a way that had the sound of a man speaking in a space where he was not alone. "I'm sorry," Sung Jin said. "I didn't have a choice. He's known about the investigation for 2 days. I tried." A sound, a pause, a breath that was too controlled. "I tried to slow it down. I tried to buy you time. But he knows about the woman. He knows she's at the estate." Jitae's hand tightened on the phone. "Sung Jin, where are you?" "It doesn't matter where I am." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and then recovered. And Jitae understood in that crack what the situation in that room was. "What matters is he's moving tonight. He's not going to wait." He said, another pause, another controlled breath. He said the woman needs to disappear before morning." The call went dead. Jitae looked at the phone in his hand for exactly 1 second. Then he leaned forward and hit the partition. "Faster!" The driver didn't ask questions. The car accelerated. Jitae called the estate security chief. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3, and the 3 rings were the longest 3 rings of his life. And then the line connected, and the security chief's voice came through, and Jitai said, "Status, right now. Guest wing is secure. I have 2 men on the east corridor. The occupant is..." A pause, a shuffle, the sound of a radio. "She's in the room, light under the door. She might be awake. Keep both men on that corridor. Nobody moves without my direct order. And I need you to check the perimeter, northwest fence line. Check it physically, right now. Send someone on foot. Is there a... Do it." He hung up and pulled up Yeonsu's number, and she answered on the first ring, which meant she hadn't slept, which meant she'd understood something was accelerating before he'd called. "Min-kyu knows," he said. "He's moving tonight. I need you to get the documentation out of Seoul. Physical copies, not digital, to the contact in Busan. You know which one." "Already moving," she said. "I pulled the files 40 minutes ago when you told me to burn the room. I had a feeling. Get out of the city. I'm already in a car." A pause. "Jitai. He has people. More than you're probably accounting for. I found 3 names in the communication records that are current Baiko members. He's been building inside the organization, not just using external contractors. 3 names. 3 people currently on the Baiko payroll who had been feeding information to Min-kyu, who might right now be inside the estate grounds or the administrative building, or positioned at points Jitae hadn't thought to cover because he hadn't known the rot went that deep. "Send me the names." The message came through in 30 seconds. He read them in the glow of his phone screen in the back of the accelerating car, and 2 of the names he recognized as estate staff, not security, not armed, but inside the walls. And the 3rd name stopped him cold. Lee Dong-hyuk, the estate's northwest perimeter guard, the man he'd just sent the security chief to find. He called the security chief back. "The man I sent to check the northwest fence, pull him back. Don't send him. Send someone else, someone not named Lee Dong-hyuk, and do it now." A beat of silence. Lee already went out. Jitae's jaw tightened. How long ago? 4 minutes. 4 minutes was enough time to open a gate. 4 minutes was enough time to signal a position. 4 minutes was enough time for a man on the inside to do the one thing he'd been placed there to do when the moment came. "Get your men to the northwest fence line right now," Jitae said. "Armed. And seal the guest wing. I don't mean lock the door. I mean put bodies in the corridor and don't move them for any reason until I'm inside those walls." He hung up and looked out the window. The estate was 6 minutes away at this speed. He did the math on 6 minutes, and what could happen in 6 minutes, and put the phone in his jacket pocket and reached under the seat for the case that was always there. He'd insisted on it after the first year of running the organization, the same way he insisted on certain structural habits, certain redundancies, because the world he operated in was one where the difference between prepared and unprepared had a body count. And he opened the case and checked the weapon inside with the automatic movements of a man who had done it so many times that his hands knew the sequence without instruction. Full. Safety on. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and sat back and watched the city thin out into the dark roads that led toward the hills. But the northwest fence line had been opened. The security chief's voice on the radio was controlled but tight. A man delivering bad news with the professionalism of someone who understood that panic was a resource expenditure the situation couldn't afford. 2 sections of the perimeter fence had been manually disengaged, the locks bypassed from the inside. Lee Dong-hyuk was not responding to calls. The infrared sensors along the northwest approach had registered movement. Multiple contacts, the chief said. At least 4, possibly more. Moving through the grounds in the tree line. Jitae's car came through the main gate at speed, and he was out before it fully stopped, moving toward the main entrance. And the security chief was there with 3 men and a face that was professionally calm and personally frightened, and Jitae grabbed his arm as he passed. "How many of our people can you absolutely verify right now? No uncertainty. People you've physically seen in the last 10 minutes. The chief counted in his head. 7, including these 3. Those 7 are your unit. Everyone else is unverified until I say different. Clear? Clear. Guest wing. Now." They moved through the main house at pace, not running. Running was noise, running was signal, but fast and deliberate. The security chief and 2 of his men flanking Jitae down the east corridor toward the guest wing. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence of sound, but presence of held breath. The building itself seeming to compress around the situation happening inside it. The guest wing corridor had 2 men on it as ordered. They were standing and alert, and they looked at Jitai coming toward them with visible relief, and he noted the relief and filed it and stopped at the door to the larger bedroom and knocked twice, short and firm. Nothing. He knocked again. Amara. A pause. Then footsteps. Slow. The careful movements of someone who had been awake and was approaching the door with caution. "Who's there?" "It's me." He kept his voice level, quiet. "I need you to open the door." The lock turned. The door opened 6 inches, and she looked at him through the gap with eyes that were wide and clear, and not frightened exactly, but were reading the situation with the rapid precision of a woman whose instincts were very good. She saw his face. She saw the men behind him. The door opened the rest of the way. She was dressed. He registered that immediately. She'd been awake, she'd heard something, or some part of her had understood that this night was not a sleeping kind of night, and she dressed and sat with the light on and waited. She was holding her phone in one hand with the grip of someone who had been deciding whether to call someone, and the slight tension in her shoulders had the quality of a person who had been afraid and had managed it down to a controlled alertness. "What's happening?" she said. Not a question, exactly. More an opening for information she'd already decided she was going to receive. "There are people on the grounds who shouldn't be here," he said. "I need you to come with me. Right now, without asking me to explain everything, because I will explain everything, but not in the next 30 seconds. She looked at him for 2 seconds. Then she put her phone in her pocket and said, "Okay," and came into the corridor. He put her in the center of the group, himself ahead, the security chief behind, the 2 corridor guards flanking, and they moved back through the house toward the interior rooms, the rooms without exterior windows, the rooms that were structurally the most defensible position the estate offered. He'd identified those rooms years ago. He'd hoped he'd never need them. They were halfway down the main corridor when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a surge, a clean cut, the whole estate going dark simultaneously, which meant the main power line had been severed at the external junction box, which meant the people in the northwest tree line had split and one group had gone for the junction while the other continued toward the house. Coordinated. Min-Kyu had planned this the way Jitai would have planned it. Identify the critical systems, take them out first, create confusion, and cover in the first 60 seconds. The security chief clicked on a flashlight. Jitai already had his phone out, screen light low. He put his hand back and found Amara's arm, and she took hold of his wrist without being told to, her grip firm and without panic, and they kept moving. The interior safe room was 30 feet away when Jitai heard the first sound. A door, somewhere behind them in the east wing, not a slam but a controlled opening, the specific sound of someone who knew how to move through a building they'd studied in advance. He stopped, put his hand up. Everyone stopped. In the dark and the silence, he listened. Footsteps. 2 sets, maybe 3, careful and precise, from the east wing. And from ahead, from the direction they were moving toward, another sound that was almost not a sound at all, just a displacement of air, a presence in a space that had been empty. They were already inside, both directions. He turned to the security chief and spoke directly into his ear. "Get her into the interior bathroom, middle room, no windows. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone." He pressed his security code into the chief's hand. A physical card, kept in his jacket for exactly this kind of contingency. "That card opens the emergency line to the police response unit. Use it if I'm not back in 15 minutes. The chief's mouth opened. "Take her," Jitai said. "Now." He felt Amara's grip on his wrist tighten. He turned. In the darkness, he could see the shape of her face, the set of her jaw, and the expression on it was not the expression of a woman waiting to be managed. It was the expression of a woman about to say something he didn't have time for. "Don't," he said quietly. "Please. I need to know you're in that room. I can't do what I need to do if you're not in that room." A breath. Her grip released. 15 minutes, she said. 15 minutes. The security chief moved her away down the corridor. Jitai turned and walked toward the east wing. The first man came out of the guest suite doorway fast and low, with the trained movement of someone who knew how to close distance, and Jite sidestepped by reflex and drove his elbow into the side of the man's neck and put him on the floor with the ugly efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years learning how to end physical confrontations before they developed options. The man went down hard. He didn't get up. Jite kept moving. Second man in the corridor ahead, backlit by nothing, just a shape, and the shape had its arm extended, and Jite was already dropping to the side when the sound came. Not the shot itself, but the suppressed percussion of it. The air punch of a round going past close enough that he felt it. And he came back up and covered the 8 feet between them in 4 steps. And the fight was short and very ugly, and he took a hit across the ribs that felt like cracking and might be cracking, and he filed that pain in the category of things that existed but didn't matter right now. The second man was on the floor. Jite stood in the corridor breathing through his nose, one hand pressed to his right side, and listened. The house had gone still again. Somewhere in the east wing, a door opened and didn't close, which meant someone was being careful about sound. He moved toward it, back against the wall, moving sideways along the panel, and the darkness that had been working against him was working for him now too, because he knew this house, and the men Min Q had sent in did not. He came around the corner into the east wing's main junction room, and Min Q was standing there. Not a flanking soldier, not an advance man. Min Q himself, in a dark jacket, with a gun held at a professional angle and an expression on his face that was, and this was the thing that hit Jite with a force almost physical, that was tired. Not guilty. Not manic. Tired and resolved, and in some terrible way almost relieved, the expression of a man who had been carrying a weight for 18 months and had arrived at the moment when it would either crush him or be set down. They looked at each other across 15 feet of darkness. "You came yourself," Jite said. His voice came out rough around the edges from the rib. He didn't adjust it. "Of course I did." Min Q's gun didn't waver. I wasn't going to send someone else for this." "Consider it." "Don't." Something moved across Min Q's face. "Don't do the cold thing. Not tonight. I've watched you do the cold thing for 8 years and not tonight. Tell me why." Jite's hand was at his side, 2 inches from his jacket pocket, and Min Q's eyes tracked the hand and came back to his face, and they both understood the geometry of the room. Not the justification, the real reason. You've been planning this for 18 months. You had someone inside the estate feeding you her schedule. You sourced a body. You forged records. You put a ring on a burned corpse and stood next to me while I identified it. His voice didn't rise. It went flatter, quieter, the way it always went when the thing underneath it was biggest. You drove me home. You sat outside with me for 20 minutes. Min Q's jaw moved. "Why?" Jite said. The silence lasted long enough that Jite thought he wouldn't answer. Then Min Q said, "Because you were leaving." "I was leaving." "Not physically, not from the organization." His grip on the gun shifted slightly, not threat, almost unconsciously. A man using his hands to find words. "But you were leaving it, every week, a little more. The baby was coming, and you were changing the way you made decisions. You were pulling back from certain things. You were thinking about something other than what we'd built, and I could see it. I could see where it was going. So you killed her." You killed her." The flatness in Jite's voice cracked slightly, just at the edge of it. "She was 8 weeks pregnant when that car went up. Our child is alive." Min Q's voice was sharp. "He's alive, she's alive, that was the arrangement. It wasn't supposed to be. She wasn't supposed to be harmed. She was supposed to wake up somewhere else, with nothing, and you were supposed to grieve and come back to what you were. And the organization, Jite took a step forward. Min Q's gun came up a fraction. "She spent 7 months on a waterfront in Incheon with no name, Min Q. She's been cleaning floors in my basement for an hourly wage. She doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know me. She's 32 weeks pregnant, and she's been alone since March, and you did that because you decided the organization needed me more than my family did. I made a decision." Min Q's voice was going ragged at the edges. "I made the decision you wouldn't make. That's what I've always done. That's what I've been. For you, for 8 years. The man who makes the decisions you won't make. I never asked you to make that one. You never had to ask. That's the whole..." He stopped. He looked at Jitai with an expression that was wrecked and furious, and somewhere underneath both of those things, deeply and irreparably ashamed, and he hated the shame, Jitai could see him hating it, could see it being processed into anger, because anger was the only form it could take in a man like Min-Kyu. I built this with you 12 years. I gave this organization the same years you did, and I would have given you anything you asked for. Jitai's voice was very quiet now. Anything reasonable. You could have come to me, you could have said any of what you just said to my face, and we could have talked. That was available to you. It wasn't. It was. You chose not to because you'd already decided. Min-Kyu was breathing hard. The gun was still up. Jitai looked at it and at the man holding it and did the calculation of the distance between them and the angle of the shot and his own right side, which was sending signals that the rib was not intact. How does this end? Min-Kyu asked. And the question was genuine. Not a negotiating position, not a tactic, but the actual question of a man who had arrived at a destination without a map for what came next. You know how it ends, Jitai said. I could have killed her. Min-Kyu's voice dropped. Tonight, I could have told the men. I didn't. I told them to bring her in, not to touch her. I still made that call. Because she's carrying my son. Because... He stopped. His mouth worked. Because I didn't want... He stopped again. Because even at the end of everything, even with 18 months of cold planning behind him and a gun in his hand and men in the grounds of the estate, something in Min-Kyu had not been able to close that last door entirely. Jitai saw it. He saw it clearly, and he didn't know whether it made it better or worse. And the answer was probably both, and that was going to take years to find a shape for, and right now was not the time. Jitai moved. Not for the gun. Not for Min-Kyu. He moved to the side, a hard pivot on his left foot that sent a wave of white agony through his cracked rib, and Min-Kyu's shot went into the wall where Jitai's chest had been, and the second shot went wide because Jitai was already inside the arm's reach, already driving forward, and what followed was not clean and was not organized and was nothing like the controlled efficiency of the corridor fights. It was two men who had known each other for 12 years in a dark room with no distance between them and everything that had accumulated in those 12 years coming through every strike. He took hits. Min-Kyu took hits. The gun went somewhere, a hard impact against the wall, and it left Min-Kyu's hand and clattered away into the dark, and neither of them went for it because by then neither of them could. Jitai got his arm around Min-Kyu's throat from behind and put his weight into it and held it, his cracked ribs screaming, his vision going slightly at the edges from the pain and the exertion, and he held it until Min-Kyu's resistance went from violent to effortful to still. He let go. Min-Kyu dropped to the floor, alive, breathing, unconscious. Jitai sat back on his heels on the floor of the East Wing junction room in the dark and breathed through his nose and put one hand against the floor to steady himself. The pain in his ribs was significant and detailed and demanded attention he didn't have for it. He sat with it for 10 seconds. His hands were shaking, not from fear, he noted distantly, but from the particular crash that came after extreme physical effort when the adrenaline began clearing. He got to his feet. He found the gun, the dark. He stood over Min-Kyu for a moment, looking at him on the floor. The man he'd trusted most in the world, unconscious on the floorboards of the house they'd both operated from for years. The man who had made the decision he hadn't been asked to make. And Jitai felt the thing he'd been keeping behind the wall trying to come through again, and he let a small amount of it come through, and then he put it back and turned toward the interior rooms. 15 minutes. He walked. The security chief met him in the corridor with two men and a flashlight, and an expression that went from professional to alarmed when it landed on Jitai's state. Sir, Min-Kyu is in the East Wing junction room. Secure him. Nobody touches him until I've made calls. He kept walking. And get me a doctor. Something's broken. The woman... I know. He kept walking. I'm going to her now. He reached the interior bathroom door and knocked twice, short and firm, the same pattern as before. A pause. The lock turned. Amara looked at him through the gap, and then the door opened all the way, and she stood in the bathroom doorway in the emergency lighting of the security chief's flashlight bleeding in from down the corridor, and she looked at his face and his side and the state of his hands, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw and turned his face toward the light, checking it, the way you checked someone you were. She turned his face toward the light and looked at the damage the way someone looked at damage they intended to do something about. He let her. That was the thing he noticed. He let her, without the reflex to pull back, without the instinct to say he was fine that had been his automatic response to any expression of concern for the last 6 months. He stood in the doorway of the interior bathroom and let Amara Brooks turn his face in the light and look at the cut above his left eye and the swelling already developing along his jaw, and he was aware that his rib was sending constant detailed reports about its condition, and he was aware that his hands were still not entirely steady, and he was aware that the woman whose thumb was moving carefully along his cheekbone, checking for fracture, had no idea that she'd done this before, had sat across from him in a hospital waiting room 4 years ago when he'd come back from the kind of meeting that sometimes left marks, and had done exactly this same gesture, with the same particular focus that was somehow both clinical and not. "Nothing's broken up here," she said. "Your eye might close tomorrow." "I've had worse." "I believe you." She stepped back. Her eyes went to his side where he was holding himself slightly differently, the involuntary adjustment of a body protecting an injury. "The ribs. 1, maybe 2. You need to sit down. I need to make some calls first." "You need to sit down," she said again. Same words, same flat delivery, no increase in volume, and something about the repetition in exactly that register. The refusal to accommodate his deflection, the patience of someone who had already decided what was happening and was simply waiting for him to catch up, made him stop arguing. He sat down on the edge of the bathroom counter. She found the first aid kit under the sink with the efficiency of someone who had learned to locate what she needed in unfamiliar spaces. And she began working on the cut above his eye with the careful, steady hands of a woman who didn't flinch at blood. Jite sat still and let her, and looked at her face 3 inches from his, and felt the grief and the gratitude and the fury at everything that had been done to her moving through him in a current he didn't try to name. "Are you going to tell me what happened?" she said. Not a question. An opening. "Yes," he paused. "Not tonight." She looked at him directly, close enough that he could see the small scar above her left eyebrow, faded gold in the emergency lighting, and he looked at it and felt the confirmation of it the way he'd felt it the first night, total and wordless and too large to hold neatly. Is it over? He thought about Min Kyu on the floor of the East Wing. He thought about the calls he hadn't made yet. He thought about Park Hyun and the 3 names Yeon-soo had sent and Sung Jin's voice on the phone saying "I'm sorry" in a room where he hadn't been alone. "The worst of it," he said. She accepted that. Put a piece of tape over the cut, pressed it flat with her thumb, and stepped back and looked at her work. Then she looked at him, the full direct look, and said, "You're going to tell me everything, when it's time." "Yes." "Not pieces, everything." "Everything," he agreed. She nodded once. Then she turned and sat down on the closed toilet lid and put both hands on her knees and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a woman processing a night that had asked a great deal of her. And Jitai sat on the bathroom counter and held his rib and didn't say anything, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had arrived at the same place by different roads and were taking a moment before the next movement. Through the bathroom door, down the corridor, he could hear the sounds of the estate being secured. Voices, footsteps, the structured activity of men following orders. His phone was buzzing against his thigh, periodic and insistent. He reached for it. Amara said without looking up from the middle distance, 5 more minutes. He put the phone back. He gave her the 5 minutes. Hot. Min-kyu regained consciousness at 3:40 in the morning, zip-tied to a chair in the secured room on the 2nd floor of the administrative building. A different secured room, not the one that had been burned. A backup Jitai had never told Min-kyu existed, because the existence of backups that your underboss didn't know about was exactly the kind of structural decision that turned out to matter. Jitai was sitting across from him when he came around. Just Jitai, no one else in the room, which was another decision. Min-kyu deserved witnesses to his exposure about as much as Jitai wanted any. This was between the 2 of them in the first instance and would have its formal resolution later, but the first instance belonged here. Min-kyu looked at him. His face was damaged, Both of them had contributed to that damage in the East Wing, and neither of them looked particularly well. And his eyes, when they focused, had the quality of a man who had hoped, on some level, that the night would end differently, and had now finished hoping. "Sung-jin," Jitai said. "He's alive." Min-kyu's voice was rough. I wanted information, not—" He stopped. "He's at a location in Mappo. I'll give you the address." Jitai looked at him. "I'll give it to you," Min-kyu said again. "I'm not using him. That's done." "Give me the address." He gave it. Jitai sent 2 men immediately, texting the address without looking away from Min-kyu, and then he put the phone face down on the table between them and settled back in his chair and looked at the man across from him with the patient attention of someone who intended to be here for a while. "The driver," Jitai said. "Park Hyun. He didn't know about the bomb." "No." "He thought he was stopping the car for a security check." "Yes." "He was paid 6 days before. Family account." Min-kyu was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes?" Jitai nodded slowly. He wasn't writing anything down. He didn't need to. Yeonsu's documentation was comprehensive, and everything said in this room was being recorded by equipment in the walls that Min-kyu didn't know was there. He was not here for information. He was here because he'd decided he needed to look at Min-kyu and ask the things that the documents couldn't answer, and hear the answers in the man's own voice, and then know what he knew. "The body," he said. Min-kyu's jaw worked. "The woman who was in that car. The woman whose ring you put on, and whose file you doctored, and who I stood in a hospital and confirmed as my wife." Jitai's voice was very level. The level had cost him something to locate, and it was costing him something to maintain. "Who was she?" "A Jane Doe." Min-kyu said it quietly. "From the contractor's network. She'd already died. Natural causes 3 weeks before. No family, no identification. The contractor specialized in—" He stopped. "She wasn't killed for this. She was already gone." Jitai looked at him. He held that answer up against the part of himself that wanted it to make a difference. The part that would prefer Min-kyu to be entirely monstrous, that would prefer the moral arithmetic to be simple. And he found that it did make a difference, a small one, and he was angry at it for making a difference. "You still put a dead woman's remains in a car and blew it up," he said. "You still stood next to me while I looked at what was left." Min-kyu didn't look away. "Yes. And then you drove me home." "Yes." The single syllable sat in the room. Jitai looked at Min-kyu and thought about all the things he'd decided about this moment. In the study, in the car, in the hours of sleepless calculation, the certainty he'd carried that when it arrived, he would know exactly how he felt. He did not know exactly how he felt. He felt many things at once, several of them contradictory, and the dominant one was not the rage he'd expected, but something older and more exhausted than rage, something that had to do with 12 years and the specific loss of a man he'd believed existed, who apparently hadn't. "I'm going to turn you over to the authorities," Jitai said. "Not our system. The state. Formal charges, documented evidence, everything Yeonsu has compiled. You'll be processed publicly, and it will be public." He paused. "I won't protect you inside. I won't send anyone after you, and I won't ask anyone to make it faster. You'll serve what you're given." Min-kyu was quiet for a moment. "That's worse than the other option." "I know it is. I know what I could do." The flatness again. Final. Closed. "That's not what I'm choosing." Min-kyu looked at him with an expression that moved through several things and arrived at something that was not acceptance exactly, but was the face of a man who had run out of alternative propositions. "She's really alive." "Yes." "The baby is healthy." A pause. "Mine." Something crossed Min-kyu's face that Jitai didn't want to look at long enough to name. He stood up from the chair and picked up his phone and walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame, the same way he'd stopped in doorways all night, the same structural pause. 12 years, Min-kyu said to his back. Doesn't it mean anything to you? That I'm still here, that I didn't run?" Jitai stood in the doorway. "You didn't stay because of loyalty," he said. "You stayed because you thought you could still control the outcome." He didn't turn around. If 12 years had meant what you're saying it meant, none of this would have happened. He walked out. The door closed behind him. He stood in the corridor and put his back against the wall and breathed through the cracked rib and the 12 years and the answer to the question he'd needed to ask in Min Q's own voice. And he held all of it for 30 seconds in the corridor where no one was watching. And then he straightened up and walked toward the elevator. Sungjin was found in an apartment in Mapo at 4:15 in the morning, dehydrated and with a badly bruised face but otherwise intact. And the call confirming this reached Jitai in the car on the way back to the estate, and he sat with the relief of it for the length of the call, and then put the phone down and looked out the window. He'd been wrong about Sungjin. He'd written the name in his mind on a list where it didn't belong, driven by the logic of evidence that had turned out to be incomplete, and Sungjin had paid for the incomplete evidence with a night in a room in Mapo, which was not a cost Jitai could repay, but was one he intended to acknowledge plainly and directly when the time was right. The wrongness of it sat with him, the ease with which fear had redirected his trust. He turned it over in the car the way he turned everything over, not to punish himself with it, but to understand it well enough that it didn't happen again. 3 days after that night, Jitai sat in the study and told Amara everything. Not a summary, not the managed version, the version stripped of what reflected badly on him or complicated her understanding of the world she'd unknowingly returned to. Everything, from the beginning, how they'd met, what they'd built, what he did, and who he was, and what the life she'd lived before March actually looked like from the inside. He told it in order and without performance, seated across from her in the 2 chairs by the window, with the late afternoon light on the floor between them. And he did not look away from her face as he spoke, because he decided that she was owed the full weight of his attention during this, that looking away would be a form of cowardice. She listened the way she did everything, still, alert, with the focused quality of a person taking information seriously rather than emotionally. Occasionally she asked a question. The questions were precise. They were the questions of a woman who was hearing something enormous and was organizing it with methodical attention rather than being overwhelmed by it, and the questions told him things about her that the amnesia had not erased. The sharpness, the refusal to accept things at their presented surface, the need to understand the actual shape of a thing rather than its outline. When he finished, she sat with it for a long time. The afternoon light moved. Jite sat and waited and did not fill the silence, because filling the silence would be for his comfort and not hers. Finally she said, "I don't remember you." "I know. I don't remember any of it. The marriage, the house, I don't have any of it." She said it plainly, without apology, without the softening that might have made it easier for him to hear. "I'm not going to pretend I do, because hearing it is enormous. I'm not going to perform a reunion that isn't real. I'm not asking you to. I need you to be clear about what you're asking." She met his eyes directly. "Because there's a difference between what I am to you and what you are to me right now, and one of us is carrying a history that the other one can't access, and I need us to both be honest about that, or none of this works." "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right. Not combative, just factual." "What are you asking for?" He thought about it for a moment. He'd had days to think about it, but the question in her mouth was specific and deserved a specific answer, not the prepared version. "Time," he said. "That's all. I'm not asking you to remember. I'm not asking you to feel what you don't feel. I'm asking for time and honesty and the chance to become someone you know." He paused. "Whatever that becomes." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through it. The practical woman's assessment of a situation, the same woman who had asked for conditions before agreeing to the accommodation, the same woman who had said not pieces, everything in a bathroom at 4 in the morning. "The baby," she said. "Is mine," he said. "And is yours. Whatever happens between us, that doesn't change. And if I decide She stopped. "If I decide that I can't, that the history is too much, or that I don't, then I'll still be his father, and you'll still have every resource I can provide, and you'll make whatever life you choose to make." He held her gaze. "I'm not using the baby as a condition. I'm not using anything as a condition. I told you that the first night." She sat back slightly, some small tension going out of her shoulders. He watched it go and said nothing about it. Okay, she said finally. Time. Honesty. She looked at him with an expression that was not warm yet. Warmth was not something that could be rushed, but had something in it that was genuine and unguarded. The look of a woman who had decided to be present to something rather than defend it against it. I make my own choices. Always, he said. Junho arrived at 5:47 in the morning on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the night of the East Wing, in the estate's medical suite with Han Jae-won attending and 2 nurses who had been hired and vetted and were the kind of calm professional women who made a difficult process feel not easy, nothing about it was easy, but held. Jitae was in the corridor outside for 4 hours and 20 minutes. He stood for the first 2 hours because sitting felt wrong, and he sat for the remaining 2 hours and 20 minutes because standing had stopped being tenable. He sat in the plastic chair against the wall with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his eyes on the floor, and he did not think about the specific things he'd taught himself not to think about. The white room, the identification, the manufactured grief, because Amara was 40 feet away doing the hardest physical work a human body does, and the corridor was not the place for his own history. When Chaewon opened the door and said that everything was fine, he stood up so fast he put his hand against the wall to steady himself. He went in. Amara was exhausted in a way that went beyond the surface. The deep cellular depletion of labor, the specific aftermath that sat in the face and the body as something more total than any ordinary tiredness. She was propped against pillows, and she had the baby against her chest, and she was looking at him with the focused, quiet attention of a woman in the first minutes of something enormous. Jitae stood at the bedside and looked at his son. Junho was small and dark-haired and absolutely perfect in the specific way that made the word perfect feel inadequate. And Jitae stood there and felt something unlock in his chest that had been closed since March, some structural thing that had been held shut by the sustained effort of functioning through grief, and the unlocking was not comfortable. It hurt, actually, in the specific way that a thing long held closed hurts when it opens. And he didn't try to manage it or put it behind the wall. He let it happen. Standing at the bedside, hands at his sides, looking at his son, Amara was watching him. She'd been watching his face since he'd walked in, the focused attention, the reading of it. She didn't say anything for a moment, then she shifted the baby slightly and said quietly, "Do you want to hold him?" He sat down carefully on the edge of the bed. She transferred Junho to his arms with the careful instruction of someone who had been doing it for 20 minutes and had opinions about the proper angle of support. And Jitae held his son for the first time and looked at his face, and the name was correct. He could see it, the rightness of it. The name they'd chosen sitting in the weight of the small body in his arms like it had always been waiting. Junho, he said. Just the name. Quietly, Amara went still. He looked at her. Something had moved across her face. Not a memory, not the full arriving clarity of return, but something at the edge of it, some disturbance at the border of the blankness, like a shape moving behind fogged glass. Her eyes had gone slightly unfocused and then refocused on him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. "What did you say?" she said. "Junho." He watched her. It's the name I wanted to tell you about. A name we'd talked about before." She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved to the baby in his arms, and she looked at him, at Junho, with an expression that was working through something he couldn't fully see. "I know that name," she said, very quietly, as though saying it louder might disturb whatever was happening. "Yes, She stopped. Her hand came up and pressed against her sternum, the involuntary gesture of someone feeling something unexpected in their chest. "I don't know how I know it. I don't have It's not a memory. It's not a picture of anything. It's just..." She stopped again. Her eyes were wet, and she was clearly angry at them for being wet, the jaw tightening the way it always did when she was refusing to let an emotion dictate her face. "It feels right," she said finally. The words came out rough. "I don't know why it feels right." Jitae looked at her and at the baby and at the word right sitting between them, and he understood that he was being given something and that what he did with it in the next 30 seconds mattered. "It is right," he said. He said it gently, without urgency, without the weight of "this means you're remembering" or "this is the beginning of something," without any of the pressure that the moment was trying to put on itself, just the plain confirmation of a true thing. That's all. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she nodded, once, slowly, and she reached over and put her hand on Junho's head, light as a breath, and kept it there. The legal proceedings against Seo Min-kyu began 6 weeks after his arrest and were handled by the state with the thoroughness that Yeon-su's documentation made possible. The charges were substantial: conspiracy, evidence fabrication, assault, a list that took 12 minutes to read into the court record on the first day. Ji-tae did not attend. He gave his deposition in writing and submitted it through counsel, and went back to the estate afterward and spent the afternoon with Amara and Junho in the garden, the one with the trees that Naomi had wanted to plant more of, which he was planting more of now because that plan had existed and it deserved to be followed through. Park Hyun was charged separately. The charge was reduced in exchange for full testimony, which Ji-tae had agreed to through his attorneys because testimony was worth more than punishment, and because the man had stopped a car and not known what would come of it. And Ji-tae was trying to be careful about the distinction between complicity and catastrophic naivety. Sung-jin came back to work after 2 weeks of recovery, and the first conversation they had about the night in Mappo was short and direct and uncomfortable in the way that honest conversations about failures of trust always were. And at the end of it, Sung-jin said that he understood if his position was different now, and Ji-tae said that his position was the same, and the difference was that Ji-tae now understood something he should have understood before, which was that trust required verification and not just history. Sung-jin had accepted that, and they'd gone back to work, and something between them was different in a way that was not worse but was more honest, which was the better version of different. The Baekho Syndicate began its restructuring in April, 3 months after the night of the East Wing. Ji-tae had spent those 3 months making a different kind of list. The operations that had a legitimate parallel, the businesses that could be surfaced and formalized, the people who were capable of doing that work, and the people who were not and would need to find different employment in the world outside his organization. It was slow work, and it was expensive work, and it generated resistance from some quarters and quiet relief from others, and Ji-tae carried it with the same patient, methodical attention he'd given to everything that mattered. He was not under any illusion that he became a different man overnight. The things he'd done, the organization he'd run, the years of decisions that didn't survive scrutiny in daylight, those were not erased by a restructuring plan and a garden in the hills. He was the man who had done those things. He was also the man sitting across from a lawyer 3 mornings a week, working through the legal architecture of turning criminal infrastructure into something his son could know about without damage. Both were true, and both would remain true, and the second didn't cancel the first. It just coexisted with it, which was the honest version of change. Amara did not recover her memories. Some fragments came back. Impressions more than scenes, feelings attached to no specific event. The occasional word or phrase surfacing from the blankness, with no image to anchor it. The neurologist she saw monthly was cautious about prediction, and Amara was impatient with caution in the specific way of someone who had made peace with uncertainty and didn't need medical professionals to pretend otherwise. The memories that were gone might stay gone. The woman she'd been before the waterfront in Incheon was accessible to her only through the accounts of others, and she had decided to treat those accounts the way she treated any information, as material to be assessed and incorporated on her own terms. She was building something new. That was the only way Ji-tae knew how to describe what he watched her do in those months. Not recovering a life, not returning to one, but constructing one from the materials available with the particular stubborn competence that he recognized, even if she didn't. She made decisions about what she wanted and went after them with a directness that took no prisoners. She enrolled in a graduate program in April Public Health because she'd read widely during the months of waiting and recovery and had opinions about systems and how they failed people in specific and preventable ways. She was an uncomfortable student in the best sense. The professors she mentioned were the ones who had been made to justify their premises. She and Ji-tae moved around each other with the careful, honest attention they'd agreed to. Not a performance of reunion, not the false warmth of pretending her blank space was filled when it wasn't. There were dinners and long evenings in the garden with Junho between them in the particular democracy of a child who doesn't care about the history of the adults holding him. There were conversations that went late and covered difficult territory and ended without resolution, because some things didn't resolve on a single attempt. There were moments when the distance between them felt very large and moments when it felt almost absent, and neither of them named either kind of moment, because naming them felt like pressure, and pressure was the thing they'd agreed to keep out. One evening in early summer, Jitai came home to find her sitting on the steps outside the East Wing entrance with Junho asleep against her shoulder, and a book open in her free hand that she wasn't reading. The sky over the estate was the kind of gold that happened rarely and briefly and demanded to be noticed, and she was noticing it, looking up at the light on the hills with the expression she sometimes had when something outside her had reached through whatever she was carrying and made brief contact. Jite sat down on the step beside her. She didn't look at him. He didn't say anything. After a moment, she said, "It's a good house." "Yes." "I don't mean the house." She shifted Junho slightly, resettled him. "I mean, this." She didn't gesture. She didn't need to. Jitai looked at the light on the hills. "Yes," he said, "it is." They sat on the step as the light went from gold to amber to the first pale gray of evening, and Junho slept between them with the absolute trust of someone too young to have learned what trust costs. And Jite felt the 6 months of manufactured grief and the night of the East Wing and the White Room and the plastic chair and all of it sitting in him, not as wounds exactly, but as the material of what he was now, the specific shape that a person becomes when they have been through particular things and come out the other side with their capacity for choice intact. He had not become simple. He had not become light. But he was here, on these steps, in this evening, and the woman beside him was alive and the child between them was real, and the man who had tried to take those things was answering for it in a courtroom, and the empire that had been built on fear was being converted, slowly, imperfectly, into something else. Amara turned the page of the book she wasn't reading. Jitai looked at his son's sleeping face. Outside the estate walls, Seoul moved through its evening, buses and lights, and 10 million lives pursuing their uncomplicated business. And the hills above the city held the last of the day's light for one long moment before letting it go. And the three of them sat in the quiet of what remained after everything that had tried to unmake them. And it was enough. It was, after everything, enough.